all kind of problems. And this was before my letter, before they sent the letter back to me from the FDA saying there was no problem. So, and this I found out, of course, after when the book was published. But then what happened in our country in 2014, in June of 2014, I had been in touch with the New York Times, a reporter of the New York Times, Katie Thomas, and she calls me one day and she says, you know that drug you were worried about? It's been removed from the market. I said, what? Yeah, Ranbaxy was removed from the market, and at the same time, there was another manufacturer, Dr. Reddy. It didn't pass dissolution tests. And just a second, 1 second. Hello, hello, hello. So they wrote me up in the New York Times, and I really felt vindicated. But at the same time, when I had written that letter to the FDA back in 2012, I also mentioned the fact that I was worried about furosemide that was coming from Ranbaxy, and that's before I knew about Dinesh, and that's because, but all I had noticed was there were again patients coming in to see me that had had heart failure. And we had stabilized them on the medicine, and all of a sudden, they're back in heart failure. So I start looking into things, and I start seeing this Ranbaxy stuff. And the one patient that really got me very concerned was a cousin of mine who had bad coronary artery disease, had significant mitral regurgitation, and then all of a sudden he has paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, and he calls me this one night and says, I'm really short of breath, and I said, well, what are you taking? And it was furosemide made by Ranbaxy. And I had some other patients at the same time with this stuff. And what we did with him and what I did with other patients, because I had no means of drug testing, was I would stop that brand and I would start another I'd go back to the name brand, and I'd, keep the dose the same. I had to have some constant. So I'd keep the dose the same, and then I would put them back on the name brand, and lo and behold, many of them would get better. And there was one patient that I had that had very bad pulmonary hypertension, and she comes in this one day. She's very fluid overloaded, and she's, what are you getting? Well, she was getting torsemide from a company, Pliva, from Czechoslovakia or someplace. I mean, it was really weird. So again, once we switched her back to the name brand, she got better. So I had that experience, and I just started noticing all of a sudden we were seeing more problems with drugs. We had, when I was in my training and early on in my career, we just write prescriptions and wouldn't think too much about it. We didn't have this problem with generics, the stuff coming from your country and from China. That just, we didn't have that. We would just, things seemed to be pretty good. But all of a sudden they realized, drug companies realized, oh, we could make it cheaper overseas, and so that started us getting into trouble. And I, when I subsequently looked up, say, Wockhardt, and saw the conditions as they were written up in Bloomberg News, what the conditions in the plants were in India, I got very concerned, and so then we started seeing other drugs. We've had recently one of the drugs that we really get concerned about is tacrolimus to prevent rejection of hearts after organ transplant, and we've seen in the past 2 years a number of patients got into very serious trouble after heart transplant. When we had stabilized them in the hospital, sent them home, the pharmacy gives them the brand that they had, and it didn't work. And it turns out one of them, again, was Dr. Reddy. And I've come to realize that there's a problem with your company, Dr. Reddy, in India. Something's wrong. And they've had so many recalls. They had, in 2019, they had like 5 different recalls in this country, and bad stuff. And I don't know why our FDA continues to let them sell the drugs, but they are. But at any rate, with the tacrolimus, we're in the process of finishing a study where we found that the drug did not dissolve properly. It dissolved too quickly, and it would make, whereas we compared it to the name brand drug, and it dissolved over a slower period of time, and then we figured that the Dr. Reddy is dissolving too quickly, and that's why the patients were getting into trouble. So we've had then the other thing that happened was we most recently, and I'm sure you all had it in India as well, the angiotensin receptor blocker, valsartan. We were warned in 2018 that it had NDMA in it, which is a carcinogen. And it turns out that came from China, and that the Chinese had changed their manufacturing process. When the drug went off of patent, they changed the manufacturing process and it used a chemical that formed a carcinogen, and that's why there was still carcinogen left in the drug. And I went back through some stuff and found out that there were 1,159 lots of, there were 3 different angiotensin receptor blockers, and when you looked at all of them and all different combinations of them with diuretics, about 1,159 lots were contaminated. So that made us very concerned, and we had a lot of trouble here in this country writing for angiotensin receptor blockers because we didn't know which batches were okay. But it turns out about a year and a half ago, I was written up in Bloomberg News about my concerns with generic drugs, and one of them was torsemide, which was packaged by Camber in India and sold. The company, the original manufacturer was Hetero, and I had a patient who had gotten into very serious trouble when that happened. And I had been in touch with Bloomberg News, and they had interviewed me about this. And in the same article, there was a gentleman who was written up. His name is David Light, and he owns a pharmacy in New Haven, Connecticut, which is testing drugs before they sell them. He is the only pharmacy in our country, that tests drugs before they sell them. And so he was written up in the same article with me, and it was mentioned that he tests drugs. When I saw that, I said, I got to call this guy. I mean, we got to talk. And we become fast friends after that. And, it turns out he's done a lot of testing. He's able to figure out which angiotensin receptor blockers don't have the carcinogen. Most recently, they have found that about half of the metformin for diabetes has the same carcinogen in it. There's a company called Amneal from India that has one of the highest doses of this stuff in it. So this has caused us trouble. At the same time, they also found that Zantac, the over-the-counter drug for gastric ulcers and stuff like that, the H2 blocker, it also is carcinogenic when it's not in the manufacturing process, but what happens is when it's dissolved in the stomach, then this chemical, the NDMA, forms, and so the drug has been removed from the market. They also did an interesting test on some ibuprofen, and of the 6 brands of ibuprofen that they tested, 2 of them didn't dissolve at all. They've also looked at Lamictal, which is a drug for seizures, and they have found some of that stuff doesn't dissolve properly. So we've done some work with them, and it's been very kind of neat when you can send a patient for medication, and it turns out the testing doesn't cost very much money in this country. If we give a patient 50 milligrams of losartan for 90 days, including the testing, it's $17. So we know when we give the patient the drug, it dissolves properly, and there's no carcinogen in it. And I've just continued to see these problems, and there is a company that's been formed in this country called Civica RX. They're a company that all the stuff that goes into those drugs are not made in China or India, and it's made in this country, and it's mainly they're making injectable drugs that are in short supply, and they're good quality. At the same time, we've had a big increase in the price of insulin in this country, and they're going to be making insulin cheaper and with good quality stuff, better than some of the other stuff that we've had. So in summary, we have definitely found issues with generic drugs, particularly with so many of them coming from India and China. And the fact of the matter is most of the active ingredients, about 90% of active ingredients, are actually coming from China. And some of the finished, we get about 40% of our finished drugs are coming from India. And you all are suffering from the fact that the active ingredients are coming from, you guys are getting active ingredients from China as well. So they've taken over a large portion of the market, and it's caused all kind of troubles. As a matter of fact, with this recent pandemic, the stuff that they were using to do some of the tests, the liquids were coming from China, and that's what delayed us doing our tests in this country. I mean, there are plenty of other reasons why we got delayed with our president and all that stuff, but that stuff was a problem with that as well. And even the NK95 masks were coming from China, and there was bad manufacturing with that, and a large number of them were recalled. So that's why in this country there are a number of us that are interested in bringing manufacturing of drugs back to this country. And I do write generically, but I'm very careful about which companies I write for. I've come to know the ones that are particularly a problem. So if you have questions, I'm here to take them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liver, for that very neat insight on this. Majority of the audience here are cardiologists and physicians, and you mentioned few names which directly relate to us. I mean, heparin, metoprolol, furosemide, torsemide, tacrolimus, atorvastatin. I remember when I was there, we were talking about at that time methotrexate, which were contaminated, antifungals, valsartan, we heard the story recently. Metformin, you told us, ranitidine is currently an active process, Zantac going on right now. And some of the company names like Ranbaxy, which was taken over by Sun Pharmaceuticals, which is currently the biggest company in India in 2014. And Sun Pharma seems to be manufacturing almost 50% of the drugs which we write. Dr. Reddy is Hyderabad based. We are in Hyderabad, so the company is our hometown. Wockhardt, Hetero is a giant in India, which also supplies APIs to other Indian companies. Mylan, which we did not discuss, but certainly is one of it. IPCA Laboratories, Amnio, all of these. I mean, particularly when US has all the checks and balances, then we have all the issues going on in the US, which means that there are ways by which they are able to bypass this, be it the complacency of FDA or their political compulsion to let things right through. I will ask you just one question. With all of these that you have, particularly 30–40% of generics in India coming from India, generics in US coming from India, what do you think? And it's just going to be a guesswork. What do you think out of the overall generic market in US? What percentage of drugs would actually pass the laboratory test if you have to make a guess?
I don't know. That's the problem is we haven't tested enough to know. And Valisure, just into, they've been only doing it for a couple of years, but they have again found the problem with they found the problem with ibuprofen, with the Lamictal. They've had I'm trying to think. They've had what other ones they've done, but the problem is we don't really know. And what I'm still left with is my clinical experience. I just had a patient, for instance, who was hypothyroid, and he had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and coronary artery disease, and had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and mitral regurgitation, had his mitral valve replaced, and had a septomyotomy a couple of years ago. And a couple of weeks ago, he calls me and he says, my heart rate all of a sudden went up to 130 beats a minute. And the first thing I thought was, well, maybe he's having atrial fibrillation. But we got talking about his thyroid hormone. And it turns out the pharmacy had just changed to the manufacturer of his Synthroid to Lupin, the company Lupin. And he just so happened within a few days before he called me had been tested, and his TSH blood level was very low, so he was chemically hyperthyroid. And I said, and then he was also switched to a different manufacturer of the metoprolol succinate, and I think it was Ingenious or something like that, and I think another Indian drug company. And so we stopped his thyroid hormone. We switched the manufacturer to the authorized generic of the metoprolol succinate. And I called him the next day and I said, "How you doing?" He says, "Well, I have a little swelling in my leg." I said, "Oh," and I said, "Well, so we got an ultrasound of his legs, and it turns out he had a thrombus behind his knee on the left side." And then I called him after he had the test done, and I said, "How you doing?" He said, "I'm more short of breath." Well, long story short, we got a CT scan the next day. He had saddle emboli in his lungs. So here I was presented with a guy whose medicine was changed, and on top of that, he had pulmonary emboli. Now, we don't know with this pandemic whether earlier on in the year he may have had the COVID virus, because his wife and he were both coughing. They had been down in Florida, and whether this was something part of the syndrome of the COVID, I wasn't sure. But clearly he became hyperthyroid because they changed his medicine. They had changed his beta blocker, and then superimposed on this, he had this other problem. So it became very complicated when they don't. In this country, unless you absolutely specify the manufacturer, and sometimes I have to fight with the pharmacies. They'll tell me, "Oh, we only carry this brand." I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "I'm the doctor. I'm responsible." But still, many times they switch the manufacturer, and we as the physician aren't aware. So nowadays, what happens when a patient comes in to see me, what I do, and they're having trouble, the first thing I do is I look at the manufacturer of what they're taking, and many times it's bad. I can't tell you the number of times I've had to change medications just because the pharmacy changed the manufacturer. And it's really, it's what happens is the wholesalers in this country decide whatever they want to carry, they'll carry it without knowing anything about the quality, just based on price. And it's become a really major problem. And, we've had readmissions to the hospital for heart failure and stuff like that, and people really suffer. So it's really a problem. And so I've been very careful. I have only a limited number of manufacturers that I use for the diuretics. And for metoprolol succinate, I use the Lynette brand, which is an authorized generic, which is actually made by AstraZeneca, and which is Swedish company. And I that's what I've had to do. But I'm pretty tough about what I write for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liver. I'll have Dinesh come in here. So, Dinesh, Dr. Liver has his problem about drugs which are manufactured in China or India, APIs or the finished product. But we are in India. We are getting the APIs from China. 90% of our APIs are from China, and 100% of our drugs are Indian made. And we have our own struggle with our local so-called brands versus generics that we see in Jan Aushadhi Kendra or CGHS or state insurance. So how do we handle this battle? Give us your thoughts about it.
Yeah, so thanks, Harry. And Anoop, maybe if there are questions for Harry, we should go with that. Let me just say a few things, because, we can always have a follow-up discussion around India-specific issues, I can come back on. But since Harry's time is valuable, if anybody who's online, on this call has questions for Harry, especially in terms of, his patients and what he sees, we might as well use today's time for doing that. But let me just kind of, give you my 2 cents on the specific issue, right? So there are, in my mind, there are two different buckets of problems that we are dealing with, right? One is related to the drug itself, and the formulation itself, and the second is India-specific stuff, which is on top of, the problems that we see with the formulation, right? So we can talk about India-specific stuff a little bit later, but let me just give you what I know from my experience, right? So our terminology in India is different. What we call brand and what we call generic is very different than what is globally accepted terms for brand and generic, right? So in the global market, a brand basically means a drug that is still under patent, right? And then when you say generic, it is an equivalent version of what the brand company sold while the drug was on patent. Those are the terminologies that are used in the global market. When we talk about our drug supply in India, we use these terms in a very different way, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what I want you to understand is that the way that we think about a generic is that the dose response that you see when you take the medicine, right? Whatever the brand actually does once you take it in, once you give it to the patient, either orally or parenterally, you will see a dose response. And the way that the standard, international standard for generic equivalence is that there could be a variation of plus or minus 20% in terms of, the Cmax, which is the highest concentration of the drug in your bloodstream, and the AUC, which is how long the drug actually stays in your bloodstream before it is excreted, through your kidneys or ADME processes within the body. So globally, what is accepted in Europe and the United States is that you could see a 20% variation in plus or minus 20% compared to the brand version. Our regulations in India actually permit 30% variations. This is our regulation. So, if you can go as low as 70% of the actual API that becomes available in our bloodstream, all the way to 130%. That is the feature of our regulation in India. Now, why does this matter? The reason it matters is because we have two different kinds of drugs that are typically used in practice, right? One are called narrow therapeutic dosage drugs, right? So anything to do with organ transplant rejection, anything to do with, like for example, Harry talked about thyroid medication, right? Levothyroxine or Synthroid. These are essentially susceptible to small changes in the Cmax, which is essentially the highest concentration of the dose response that we see in our bloodstream. These drugs, this class of drugs, are highly susceptible to these. And so for what happens is that even if you see a change of plus or minus 2 or 3%, the physiological manifestation of this is really, really significant. And then there are broad range therapeutics that we have where it doesn't really matter. Like, for example, if you take an antibiotic, even if 500 milligram erythromycin only contains 300, you still get your 300, right? And it helps sort of look at the pathogen and figure out. I mean, obviously we see long-term effects of antimicrobial resistance, but at least in that particular instance, you will see some activity. But if you're using a narrow therapeutic index drug, small changes, small variations within the dosage available manifest very largely physiologically when you deal with it. That is the problem. What we see when we see batch-to-batch variability, that Harry is talking about, right? When the pharmacy switches from metoprolol succinate made by Wockhardt to metoprolol succinate made by Dr. Reddy's laboratories, you will see a variation, and this has been clinically documented by Harry in Cleveland Clinic to the extent that the clinic maintains a blacklist, right, Harry? You know where you buy from, who you buy from. There are specific companies the clinic doesn't buy today because it creates a liability for the clinic in terms of what is really happening. And so that is the first global issue that we are dealing with. The problem in India is that our regulations do not even sort of monitor any of this stuff, right? I mean, our regulations essentially allow for a much wider variation in how our medicine works, number one. Number two, let me just give you another example. All of these companies have multiple recalls in the United States because you see there's a problem with dissolution, meaning that the drug is either dissolving too fast or it is not dissolving enough when it gets into the gut acid. When was the last time you actually saw a recall in India? We don't have recalls in India because the law does not actually ask for it.
Yeah.
We don't. Yep. And so the point I'm trying to tell you is that the fundamental problem that we have in India is our regulations are not on par with what is acceptable globally. So the same companies that make drug for the United States, make it to. Sorry? Anup, can you repeat the question? I can't hear it properly.
No, there is some crosstalk. Let me get that sorted out. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
No, so if there's a question, maybe what you could do, Anup, is repeat it, because I know that some of the participants are on cell phones and things like that.
Right.
So it might be a good idea to, especially if there are questions for Harry in the time that we have left.
Right.
If you could just repeat it for the benefit of Harry, that would be better, and then Harry can answer. But going back to the point that we were talking about, right? In India, we don't have drug recalls. Because the regulations don't actually ask for drug recall. So the same companies that make product for the United States, they will make a second standard quality product, right? It's a different quality product, for Indian market, which is a big issue for us. I mean, we don't really understand how this actually does. We understand how this actually happens, but unless we change a regulation, it's very hard for us to address that. But I think since we have Harry on the phone today, let's just go back and talk a little bit about patient anecdotes, right? Harry, maybe you can talk a little bit about the kinds of things that you see when you see, when patients come back with, problems. Like, for example, one of the things with metoprolol succinate is, you have patients, on dialysis or diuretics, and what cross-reaction do you see? I mean, since they're all cardiologists on the call today, they'll probably appreciate, those kind of anecdotes that you could have.
Well, in terms of the metoprolol succinate, it's a difficult drug to make. It's a sustained release drug. And AstraZeneca was the one that started making it years ago, and it's just difficult. They have little pebbles or something in the tablets, which then gets slowly absorbed, and that mechanism is never released when the drug goes off of patent. That portion of it, and the individual drug companies have to come up with a way of figuring out how to make it. But the problem has been in this country, they only have to show in the blood levels are up in that 80 to 125% levels in 24 normal volunteers. Well, that's not, patients, that's not very many patients to have, and they're normal volunteers. So that doesn't take into account people with renal disease and all the other things that people get. And so that particular drug's been a difficult one. But what we see when it's not working, the heart rate goes up, they get chest pain, they get short of breath. And I've had a lot of patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and we recognize that, they just don't do well when they get changed to different manufacturers. The diuretics are a real problem now. There are no name brand diuretics made in this country anymore. Everything is generic. And I found, for instance, there's a company called Hikma, which is a British company that we get in this country, and so far that seems to be a good one. But the torsemide that's packaged by Camber, made by Hetero, is absolutely terrible. It just doesn't work. I mean, I've had so many patients that have had so much trouble, and other associates of mine see the same problem where they just, and furosemide is equally a problem. And, when we only have 2 or 3 loop diuretics anymore, and none of it is made name brand, it's a problem. And there are no new ones coming out. So it becomes a real problem. But I have found some companies that I try to deal with still with companies that have relations in this country, realizing some of them are still made in India, hoping that they are testing them when they come over here. And for the most part, it has worked. I mean, it just sort of was. I was just looking to see if I had my list here, but I just have kind of. I don't see what I did with it. Like for instance, I'll use Mylan, even though I know they've had some trouble, but they are still an American company, and the stuff gets made. They're probably testing it. They're not testing. They've had their issues, to be honest with you. But wait, let me give you I want to tell you which ones I came across from India that I thought were problems. I just want to see what you all think. Hold on one second.
So while Dr. Liver is looking at his list, I request all the audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself when somebody is done speaking. and then you can ask the question to Dr. Lever or Mr. Thakur, either.
Okay, here we go. 1 second. All right, the ones that I've come across that I didn't like were Accord, Amneal, Ascend, Arabindo, Caraco, Citron, Cipla, Glenmark, Lupin, and Solco actually comes from China. Sun Pharmaceuticals and Zydus. Zydus, they say USA, but I know that's an Indian drug company. So those are the ones that I tend to stay away from. And it's interesting. We've had a problem in this country. There's only one company making Verapamil now. I don't know what you have over there, but only one making it is Glenmark. And I've had trouble with Glenmark over the years. They've had issues also. The ones that I use is Hikma, Lynette. There's a one called North Star, Par, Prasco. Prasco actually sells name brand drugs under a generic name in this country, so it tends to be cheaper. There's a company called Qualtest that sells generically. Sandoz, Watson, Westward. Teva has been a little questionable from Israel. They've had some issues, and they're actually been accused of price fixing. So there have been some issues with there. And then there's another company I use called Upshur Smith. That they seem to be okay, but it's getting harder. It's getting much harder to and then you have to hope that the pharmacy will get what you want. And sometimes I really get very, very difficult with them. And the other thing to mention is there's another, in addition to Catherine Eban's book Bottle of Lies, which I think is published in India now. There's another book called China RX, written by Rosemary Gibson. And it goes into a lot about the problems with the drugs coming from China, and particularly she talks a lot about what happened with the heparin. That's another one to read.
Dr. Lever, all the company names that you mentioned, that pretty much makes up pretty much all the list in India that we have. Anybody has any questions for Dr. Lever particularly? Please raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself and ask any questions. While audience thinks over, Dr. Lever, I have a question for you. So when you mention the drug and their ineffectivity, do you also see drug being constituting more amount of active chemical than what they are supposed to? Like, do you ever overdose somebody because of
I've usually found it's the other way. It just doesn't work. There's not enough in it. It's more that there's not enough than there's too much.
Okay.
I don't think I've ever seen a time. I don't think I've ever seen a time where I was over. The only time I got into trouble with a patient with furosemide was a guy who, when I switched the manufacturer to a better one, he had non-obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and was in heart failure. And I realized they had changed it to Ranbaxy. When I changed it to a better brand, he got very hypokalemic because it was working so well, and we had to admit him to the hospital. Very bad. But But usually what I've done is just keep the dose the same from the manufacturer that I don't think is a good one to the one that I think is all right. But usually it's that it doesn't work. It seems to be the dose is too low. It's not that I've not recognized too much so far.
So one of the things that I think most of the cardiologists in India, particularly my audience here, I think they would relate to, that when we are in the cath lab, the ACT response to the heparin that we administer is totally out of place. It is absolutely unpredictable, whether you give it at 50 or 70 units per hour, units per kilogram. In few people, you can give 15,000 units of heparin and the ACT wouldn't buzz at all. It would barely touch 200. And in certain people, you would give 7,000 of heparin and their ACT is through the roof. It is more than 999 and the machine can't detect. So it is a difficult thing for me to reconcile in terms of whether it's the patient factors which are different or it is the drug factors which are different. What would you say?
I think what you have to do is try to get different manufacturers and get some idea of which way things are, and maybe even chemically get it tested. I mean, I think we've got to be doing more testing. I have some relations with some people in this country now that they want to form a company that will arrange for testing of drugs, and then they will be labeled that they're in good quality, and separate from what the FDA is doing, which I think our FDA is not doing a very good job. And so this would be an independent company that would give their seal of approval, and you'd have some assurance that when you bought it, that it would work. And I think that's the thing that's going to have to happen. One of the other things that we didn't talk about is, how do the drugs get here from India? How are they shipped? What are the conditions that they're shipped under? Does it come in a container ship, or is it flown in an airplane? Is it too hot, too cold? That's another problem. And coming a long distance, you got to worry about that. Now, your drugs already, I understand, are a lot of them are made over there, but you must, but it gets hot. Your country gets hot. How's it shipped? How are they? What are they doing about watching for refrigeration? I mean, maybe they are. Probably they're not. But that's another issue that needs to be looked at. There's more testing of food in this country than we have testing of drugs from around the world. There's a company in this country called Nestle's, and I've had a patient who's a vice president of Nestle's. They make all kind of food. Everything is tested before it leaves the factory. Everything. Had another patient that works for a paint company, Sherwin-Williams. Every batch of paint that they sell is tested before it leaves the factory. Paint, stuff you're going to put on the wall. We're not swallowing this, but every batch gets tested, and we don't do the same thing with our drugs. And that's a big problem. Everything should be tested at a certain place in the supply chain before it gets to the patient. That's what needs to happen, and we're not doing that. That's a worldwide problem. Except there's one pharmacy now in New Haven, Connecticut.
There is one audience question, Dr. Liver, Mr. Thakur, any one of you can take. So the question here is that heparin is a biological drug rather than a chemical drug. So you can't actually standardize the heparin dosing, and the only way to do is to check ECT. Is that a correct interpretation of why we see so much of variability?
But again, I think it has to do with how you're putting it together. Are there things added to it that might interfere? Do they really put in there what they say they're putting in? I mean, is the amount of drug they're putting in per cc really what they say? I mean, I think you have to test it.
Right.
That's. Go ahead.
I have one more question for you, Dr. Liver, and this is not that much of a problem, or I should say not a problem, but a phenomenon in US as it is in India, and that is a fixed dose combination of tablets. Now, when I was there, I don't remember ever writing a fixed dose combination pill, but in India, majority of the tablets that we are writing are so-called FDCs. And what is your take on that? Do you think that we should be worried more about FDCs than about single component drugs, or they all are the same?
When I'm treating hypertension, I usually write for the diuretic separate from the antihypertensive drug. I don't usually use combinations. I tend to write separate. I've always done that. I've never felt comfortable. After a while, maybe if the patient is really stable on the one combination, maybe I'll write, but I don't do that often. The other thing about hypertension is, people come in and all of a sudden their blood pressure is not under control. Now, is it because there's something wrong with the patient, or is it because there's something wrong with the drug? And sometimes people get on more drugs than they need because the drugs that they were given don't work very well. So that's another place where you got to go back and see what are they given, who the manufacturers are, and then if it may be you can get away with less drugs if you have the right manufacturer.
Perfect. So that FDC thing, I think one of the things which is also unresolved is that there is a basic approach difference between Americas versus the European market, where Europe seems to be both in the guidelines as well as in the practice. They seem to be relying more on fixed dose combinations as compared to United States. And in India, which follows more of a European guideline than American guidelines, I think that fixed dose combination in India are very rampant, not just in hypertension, but for instance, post PCI in patient whom we put a stent, it's a very routine practice to give a fixed dose combination of a statin and an aspirin and a clopidogrel. So we typically do that as a combination. Do you think that's a good practice? Almost all of us do that.
I think I would rather give them separate. There's too many there are too many variables when you're doing that, and I think I don't know of anybody here doing that. No, I wouldn't do that.
Dinesh, question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Lever, go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
No, it may be easier for the patient to just take one pill, but you got too many variables there in one tablet. I wouldn't trust that, because then you don't really know if something's not working. Is it, what's going on? I wouldn't do that.
Dinesh, this is a question for you. Do we have a FDA equivalent in India who would test drugs rather than just regulation? They're not talking about the regulatory mechanism of the government.
No. All they do is all our FDA has done is go around and inspect factories. They're not testing anything. And as a matter of fact, now there's no testing going on because of the pandemic. Nothing is being inspected at this time. And the fact of the matter is, most of the factories, they give them 3 months notice, so that basically they clean up their act before the FDA comes, and then they go back to their old ways when they leave. And that's a problem too. Yeah. They need to have more. Yeah. They need to have it. One of the things I think is that we need to have inspections they need inspectors in the plant all the time. They need or there's got to be there's got to be testing. I mean, you've got to test this stuff before it gets to the patient. That's
so in India, Anup, I think we have a regulator. It's called the Central Drugs Control Standards Organization. It's a part of the Ministry of Health, but it's a very dysfunctional regulator, like everything else in India. They don't really do a good job of ensuring the quality of our drug supply. Maybe we're getting very close to an hour. At some point in time in the future, what we can do is look very closely at the Indian regulator and our drug supply, because, as you said, we have some very unique issues in our country, right? I mean, fixed dose combinations is one example of it, the fact that we have these Jan Aushadhi stores which are selling low cost, supposedly low cost medicines, but there is obviously not a lot of confidence in the quality of what is being sold there. Let's if there is further interest in this topic, maybe we can do a follow-up discussion uniquely focused on issues related to India, because we are very close to almost an hour at this point in time. But to the question that you're asking, yes, there is an equivalent regulator in India, but it doesn't do much. It doesn't do much in terms of what they actually do to try and secure a drug supply.
Perfect. Thank you. Any questions that DGCA? What does DGCA do, Dinesh? If you know this.
The DGCA is the Directorate of Civil Aviation. DCGI is the Drug Controller General of India. Okay. The Drug Controller General of India is the head of the regulator, the CDSCO, right? CDSCO is an organization, the Central Drugs Control Standards Organization, and then the DCGI is the head of that organization. It's just like the FDA is the organization, and the commissioner of the FDA is the head of the organization, right? So we have DCGI, who is the head of our drug control organization in India.
And one of the questions is, are vaccines equally vulnerable to quality testing? Should we be testing vaccines as well, or?
No, I think so, and I think right now that's very timely. How do we know? I mean, we got a president in this country who only wants to get the vaccine out by November the 3rd, so it comes out before the election. Yeah. I mean, we it's terrible. We've had, for a country like ours, compared to yours, there have been more people that have died and gotten sick in our country, even though your population is more than ours. Then it's incredible. We are in terrible trouble in this country right now. We are just it's just awful. And most countries now won't even let people from our country go to their country because of the virus. It's a mess.
Yeah.
So, is there any?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Please, Dinesh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, so vaccines, I think, is a different topic, and we should, have a different conversation because, the way that vaccines are produced and the immunogenicity of vaccines, right, is a different way of thinking about compared to what we do for medicines. But the basic sort of principle still remains what Harry said, right? We really need to have proper testing done of the safety of these vaccines because there is already a section of the population who doesn't believe in vaccines, right? In immunogenicity.
Right, exactly.
And so if you don't do testing properly, we are going to undermine public trust in once vaccines are out there. So it'll backfire on us if we don't do proper testing of vaccines from a safety point of view.
One of the questions that came is there any online reliable source or a list where we can get a list of bona fide medications which are currently in the market, which are tested both in India or in US, doesn't matter?
Yeah.
Is there any such repository?
No, only thing you can get is if you get in touch with this Valisure, VALISURE, they'll tell you what they look at. And they'll even take some patients' drugs if they're worried that they're not working right. They'll do some testing on them. So that's the only testing laboratories around. But this one is more clinically oriented, and they test what they sell. And if they find a bad batch, they throw it away.
So, Dr. Lever, before we close, Dinesh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Anup, so here is the thing, right? I think this is a question that I get asked all the time. But if you think about this, this is counterintuitive, right? So the assumption we make is that once the regulator approves a drug, it is supposed to be equivalent to the brand, right? So that, you can't really have a website or a list that says, okay, this drug made by this company is better, because it goes against the notion that once the regulator approves the drug is supposed to work as intended. And that is the reason why you will not find a list or a website someplace that says that even though the FDA has approved all of these drugs, these ones are the ones that actually work, because it goes against the premise of having the regulator in the first place.
Right. Dr. Lever,
that assumes. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
That assumes that you can trust them.
Yes,
you got to have trust.
No, absolutely.
And if you don't have trust, you've got a problem.
Right. So, since we discussed a little bit about problems unique to India, Dr. Lever, what would you recommend before we close this session for cardiologists practicing in India? Because, we can't go and test drugs, and we have what we have. So, how do we improve safety to our patients?
I think you have to try to get a feeling for what you have and how if the brand gets changed, does the patient get worse? Or you have to sort of watch what's going on with the patient, and that's one of the things that I learned was when I realized that we were having a drug quality problem. I would, we'd see how the patient does. And if it's not doing well, then I would change the manufacturer. Because what it does is, if the drug isn't working, then you get into all kind of problems of, the blood pressure's out of control. The patient, or they go into heart failure or whatever, you're wasting time and money and maybe threatening the life of the patient. So I think you have to kind of get a feeling for what you have available to you. And is some of it better than others? If it's not, then what you got to do is there's got to be some movement in India to point this out, to say, look, you can't continue this way. And one of the things, we don't know what's going to happen in this country, but if we can get this pandemic straightened out, there was some talk in the Congress of this country that we would go and make, we'd try to bring the manufacturing of drugs back here. And in that way, we could maybe be more assured that it's better quality. And if that were to happen, well, then maybe the buying of drugs would go the reverse way. Maybe they would start buying drugs from us instead of you guys. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's just there's so much fraud and stuff in the pharmaceutical industry. It's a bad problem, and and you've got to be aware, and that has to be on your checklist. When the patient isn't doing well, is it the drug I'm giving them? And
so
that's basically. Go ahead.
Sorry. So should we actually be more surprised that our drugs actually work in India rather than not working?
I think so. I mean, I think the one problem now we have is with this metformin, and we still don't know exactly why some of the metformin that's sold in this country is okay, and some of it, about half of it, is carcinogenic, and we haven't seen quite why that is. But there's been this Valisher's done a lot of testing of them, and they know which brands don't seem to be carcinogenic. I mean, it's crazy. Can you imagine giving somebody a drug that could cause cancer? I mean, that's crazy.
So, Dr. Liver, few million doses of metformin were recently recalled in the United States, and the manufacturer was an Indian company. What do you know about what happens to those drugs which are recalled? So they are already on the shelves in pharmacies across the United States. These are recalled. What happens to those drugs?
Well, there's two different kinds of recalls, and some of them, if it's a class 1, I don't know what they've done with the metformin, to be honest with you. If it's a class 1 recall, it's immediately removed from the shelf, and the patient has to be notified. But we have another problem there. What batch of drug did the patient get? And in our country, if you have the stock bottle, the big bottle that has 200 tablets in it, and then each one you get 30 tablets out of it for the patient. They do not put the lot number on the small prescription bottle that the patient gets. If you're lucky enough and you get a stock bottle, then the lot number is there. But for prescription drugs, so far they don't have a lot number, and that's a major problem. If you buy a drug across the counter like 200 milligram ibuprofen, it's got a lot number on it, and it's crazy. So you don't need a prescription for this stuff, and there's a lot number, but the stuff you need the prescription for, they don't put a lot number. So we're far from perfect in this country.
Dinesh, what happened to that metformin tablet which got recalled?
Well, I mean, I think that when they know, once they know that if this Amneal, for instance, I would hope that they've removed that stuff, all of their stuff from the shelf. But I don't know for certain.
So, Anup, this is another issue that we need to at some point discuss. There have been instances where when a drug lot is recalled from the United States, right, the company essentially repurposes that lot and sells it in India. They have actually admitted this on the record.
Oh, boy.
Some Indian companies have. So, so we have some challenges there that we really need to think about, because what happens is that they make a recall. By law, they're supposed to destroy the batch, right? A recall batch, because it doesn't meet specifications. But what they do is they take it back and sell it in India, and it's a criminal offense. But they do that. But there are instances of that has happened in India.
And is there a way for us to know that lot number so that we can look at which lot number we are giving? Are they the same lot number or they're rebatched?
Oh, well, they'll probably change the number. If they're doing that, they'll probably change the number.
Yeah. So remember how we get our drugs in India, Anup. We get blister packs, right? In the U.S., as Harry said, you get big bottles which are essentially dispensed into smaller prescription bottles by the pharmacist. Right. So what happens is that when the big bottle is recalled, the big bottle that they ship to the U.S., it is repackaged as a blister pack with a different lot number and sold in the Indian market. So you will not be able, even if you go to the U.S. FDA website that lists out the lot number that was recalled from the U.S., it will not be the same lot number that is printed on the blister packs that is sold in India. So, there are some systemic issues we have, right? By law, they're not supposed to do that, but many companies do this.
Okay, so I don't know if we can take more than an hour of depressing news, but anybody has got any questions for Dr. Harry Liver, who is here with us to answer your questions or concerns? And Dinesh will probably get you back some other time and pick your brain again, because I don't think 1 hour will do the justice.
That's fine. Since Harry is here, if any questions if anybody has questions for Harry, let's use that time right now.
So, Dr. Liver, how is Cleveland Clinic doing things differently other than keeping a tag on which drugs are good or which drugs are bad?
That's pretty much. That's a big step, though. That's a big step. and
Okay.
that's what we do.
Are you seeing quality issues in manufacturing process in U.S. Manufacturing plants as well, or is it pretty much China and India that you're seeing?
We've had some troubles over the years, but not to the degree that we've had. Not to the degree
we don't make
that,
anything. We don't make anything in the U.S., Harry, because everything that is sold in this country comes from overseas.
They do some, but not nowhere near. Well, I mean, it's clear we're getting most of it from India and China.
Right.
So, Dr. Lever, here is one more question, which I think I know the answer, but maybe not. And Dinesh, you can chip in as well. So, isn't that when a drug goes from brand to generic, then the generic company would be literally making the same thing using the same methodology that the brand company was making? Then how is it different?
That can be part of the problem. Is that first of all, the inactive ingredients may not be the same, and they don't. They have to come up with their own way of making the drug, so they dissolve and all that kind of stuff. And it's and in this country, the FDA says, it's very difficult for us to find out who's really making the API, because the FDA says that's confidential information. Well, that's crazy. Yeah. We need to know who's making it. We don't know who's making it.
Yeah. So the answer to the question you're asking is that no, the formulation that the generic companies make is not identical to the brand.
No.
What is required by law is that the active ingredient has to be the same. But the inactive ingredients, as Harry said, whether it's a colorant or a binder or other excipients, they can be changed. And so you will not get an identical composition of the formulation, whether it's a solid oral dosage, like a capsule or a tablet, or a parenteral. It is not going to be 100% identical to what the innovator company sells.
So let me make sure I understand. So let's say rosuvastatin, Crestor, goes off patent, and once it goes off patent, wouldn't it be telling the generic companies their excipients and their non-active ingredients so that the generic company can duplicate the same thing?
They got to figure it out.
By law, they're not required to have exactly the same excipient. So I'll give you an example, Anup, and this is not a cardiovascular drug. This is a drug called isotretinoin. It's a black box label drug. It's used essentially for prevention of acne. And the innovator in this particular case was Roche, right? When the drug went off patent, the Indian company Ranbaxy began manufacturing this. And this is a black box label drug, meaning that it's got to be dispensed under control. One of the excipients that were used in order to formulate this drug by Roche was essentially a substance of like wax, right? Because it held the particles of the active ingredient together. And wax was added as excipient and essentially molded into a tablet. But when Ranbaxy started making this drug, what they did was, instead of wax, which was more expensive, they essentially substituted that to oil, which was cheaper than buying wax. You know what happens to oil in high temperatures, right? It becomes rancid. It breaks down, which basically means that the formulation began breaking down. Now, imagine this is a drug that has side effects as suicidal tendencies in children. This is typically prescribed to young adolescent teenagers to control acne. We saw significant adverse events, and that was traced back to the fact that the generic company substituted a substandard oil for the edible wax component of that excipient, which essentially caused the drug essentially to fail. Now, by law, they were actually allowed to do that. And this is a real-world example I'm giving you.
So I'm guessing when that same drug was sold in India, they were never sold with wax, I'm guessing?
No.
Because Roche wouldn't market in India, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So India never saw the real version of that drug, even if it was given by the Ranbaxy or what. Okay. And the same probably can be extended to a lot of other medications that we use currently.
Exactly, because what happens is once the generic companies start making drugs, in order to cut costs, they will find cheaper ingredients, inactive ingredients, because by law they're allowed to substitute those. I mean, they are required to disclose that to the regulator, which in many cases they do not do that, but by law they're allowed to substitute cheaper, more inexpensive ingredients, as excipients into the same formulation.
So one more question that I'll come. I think we are pretty much getting quite late here. So Dr. Liver, I'm guessing the rivaroxaban or Xarelto is still under patent in US, right? There is no other company making this other than the parent company, right?
Well, but that drug's a big problem because there's no real good test to measure how anticoagulated the patient is.
Yes, that's a clinical.
Yes, yeah. And that's a big problem. And I still, I'll be honest with you, I still use Coumadin because you don't know how well anticoagulated the patient is, even if you're giving them the brand name.
Yes.
That's a major problem.
So Dinesh, my question is, in India, rivaroxaban is sold by other companies as a marketing partner to the parent company.
Yep. Janssen.
How does that work? How does that work? Are they using the same molecule, same thing?
Yeah, so again, this will take a little bit of time to explain to you. What happens in India is that we get, our law allows what are called, loan licensing agreements, right? So Janssen doesn't want to sell rivaroxaban in India because it's too expensive for them to be able to do that. So what they do is they enter into an agreement with a local manufacturer. And they say, okay, you know what, we will give you a license to make it. But then the problem here is that Janssen essentially takes a step back and say, you're responsible for quality control. And our quality control procedures in India are regulated by the CDSCO, which majority of our problems come from, right? So Janssen, while you can say that they got the know-how and understanding of the drug from Janssen, it's a local manufacturer then is responsible for formulating it, making sure the quality control is exercised properly, which is where most of our problems lie. So that's how it works. And unfortunately, we have to fix our regulations for this.
Because as Dr. Liver pointed out, for drugs like these where you can't really test their clinical efficacy by doing a test like for Coumadin, this becomes even a bigger problem. Because I think...
And not just for this, Anup, if you look at anything to do with CNS drugs, right, in the drugs used in psychiatry or mood disorders, you typically titrate those drugs under supervision, medical supervision. And even small variations in availability of the drug, whether you're looking at serotonin inhibitors or dopamine inhibitors, you see significant variations in clinical psychiatry. And that's an area that I'm really afraid even to look because that's how bad things are in India.
Right, because Dr. Raghu, who was here, I think he's not in the audience right now, he was sharing his experience where two of his patients, post-atrial fibrillation cardioversion, he appropriately put them on full dose of Pradaxa, which is dabigatran, but not the Pradaxa brand, the Indian brand. And two patients of his came in with acute stroke and acute embolism, and one of them succumbed to it. And Dr. Raghu was feeling so bad about if he would have done things differently. But he put the patient on appropriate therapy as written in the textbook, except the fact that it was a homemade drug. So there is no way to test whether that drug is working.
That's right. That's a major problem.
And as Harry said, right, I think that we as physicians, you guys take it for granted that once the drug is approved by the regulator, it's supposed to work as intended. I mean, you don't go back and question every dosage of the drug saying, will this work or not? That is not a variable in your practice. You have enough variables physiologically in the patient itself, right? So you take it for granted the drug's supposed to work as it is. And that is the problem that we have in India. We really need to educate and tighten up our regulations and the regulator so that, that should not be a variable in your practice as cardiologists. You have enough variables anyway within patient's physiology to deal with.
Right. We are about 18 minutes out in time, so I would like to close. Anybody have any questions for Dr. Liver or Mr. Thakur? Dinesh, we'll have you next time when we'll talk about Indian specific scenario, because I think a lot of us will be interested in hearing that. Praneeth, you want to give your closing comments, and we'll wait for if there is somebody has any questions. Praneeth, your closing comments for the session.
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Harry, and thank you, Dinesh, for your insightful thoughts. It's an amazing discussion, but at the end of the day, it feels as if I'm naked now. There is nothing that you can trust, or you're really very uncomfortable to prescribe drugs. And every time you have to question, because most of the popular pharma companies you have mentioned have issues. So I don't know, it's a bad feeling to say, but very insightful as well. And I hope that things will be better, and where these worries don't strike in physicians when they are practicing. And thank you all for the questions and comments in the chat box as well.
Thank you, Dr. Liver, for being with us here for this session. And thank you, Dinesh, for your time, and we'll chat again soon.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Anup. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good day, gentlemen, and good night to all my audience who are here in India. All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.